Hello, this is London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. This poem by William Blake seeks to explore the corruption, the hypocrisy, the inequality of London society in the early 19th century. Being part of the Romantic movement, he follows similar patterns and structures, similar plot lines really to the poems we've looked at already, Ozymandias and Extract from the Prelude, in so much as he is concerned with the beauty of the natural world, and in this particular poem, the sort of destruction of it by the people and of course and the environment, in terms of how people just sully that environment and don't seem to care very much. Now, the people who do the sullying, the people who do the destruction, are not necessarily those at the bottom of society, but those at the top. Let's take you through the plot of the poem firstly. Straightforward enough title. This is London. It's titled London because that's the way that Blake sees the poem. The plot. I wander through each chartered street. He goes on a walk, and as he goes on a walk, these are the things that he sees. What does he see? Through streets which are controlled by the Thames, he notices in every face that he sees marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, in this instance, the first instance of the word mark is notice, and the second and the third instances of the word marks might be more to do with scars, wounds, blotches, physical ailments. He carries on. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. As he continues on his walk, he notices and hears more people crying, calling out, sobbing. They're kind of destitute. And what does he notice in those cries? Manacles, handcuffs, something which is restraining and imprisoning the people. We'll come back to that line. Then he provides slightly more specific information as to, well, not just man, it's particular people. Chimney sweepers, those at the bottom of society, presumably children put to work, nobody chooses to climb up a chimney, but put to work in unsafe, unsanitary, just terrible and terrifying conditions, really. So, from the people he hears how the chimney sweeper cries, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier, so the soldier sighs. To be hapless, maybe it means to be stupid, maybe it means to be without power, without agency. I love the word agency. They're without agency, and the soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But mostly, I hear, through the midnight streets, so in the darkness, in the dead of night, really, what he hears is how the youthful prostitutes, how the young people are forced to sell themselves, how the youthful harlot is another word for a prostitute, somebody has to sell themselves, how the youthful harlots curse, how they swear, but we know that the word curse also has its other meaning. If we swear, that's one thing, but if I put a curse on you, and I'm not planning on it, but if I did, and I put a curse on you, well, it's like a hex. It's the idea that you're going to be punished because you've done something wrong. And in this instance, who might these young people be cursing? Who is it who's done something wrong? It's the wealthy, it's the powerful, it's those who have influence, it's those people who have done wrong. How the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. Gosh, this is terrible, isn't it? The prostitute appears to have a child, and the child is crying, and blights with plagues, disease, the marriage hearse. And what we have here is this juxtaposition of the incredibly young, the infant who cries, and the idea of a hearse, synonymous with death, dead bodies, put in caskets, coffins, placed in a hearse, transported from one place to another. So we have the contrast, the juxtaposition of the young and the old, but we also have the added contrast, the added juxtaposition of the marriage hearse. And usually people get married because they're full of joy and they love someone. We don't necessarily associate marriage with death, or at least I hope we don't. And so we have this rather terrifying image on which to end the poem. It's not a happy poem, is it? And in the poem, William Blake seeks to address the ills of society in London in the early 19th century. Some context for you and some background information and some keywords. The poem London comes from a collection of poetry called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. London comes from the Songs of Experience collection, where Blake seeks to demonstrate the corrupting effects of the modern world, the corrupting effects of industrialization, the corrupting effects on the people at the bottom of society. In the Songs of Innocence collection, Blake prioritizes sort of purity, innocence, hope, the naivety of youth. There's an optimism in these poems. And then the Experience collection sort of swoops in and demonstrates that for nearly all of the time, any kind of positivity, any kind of optimism or hope is completely misplaced and therefore utterly erroneous. It's an error, it's wrong. In the poem, Blake alludes to this to a degree, but it's the idea of divinity and humanity. Divinity is a reference to God. Blake essentially believed that God resided within each of us. And as a consequence, Blake seeks to reject organized religion because, well, the Christian church, which would have been dominant at the time, it was early 19th century, in theory was designed to help people, particularly those at the bottom of sort of economic ladder. And in this poem, we can see how it doesn't help anyone at all. In fact, it imprisons those people who are most impoverished and seeks to keep them in their place. So one of the ironies of Blake's poems is that he suggests that, well, God doesn't exist through a church, through any kind of organized religion. He suggests that there is divinity in each of us. But then rich people are people, powerful people are people. Where's the God in those? And there's the irony. Contextually, the social inequality of poem, that's seen in the poem, is a representation of what's going on in the time. Social inequality, as it says on your page and on the screen, was exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution. More factories, more sort of manual work that was in the cities, sort of more engineering projects. This is the early part of the sort of train network being created, for instance. We talk about the train network as now as perhaps being sort of slightly crumbling train network at times, these days, that is. But it was created in the early 19th century, at least initially. And how did it come to be? Well, you had to get people to build it, to create it. Is it pleasant work? Not really. Is it safe work? No. Is it the kind of work that paid well? Absolutely not. Was it the kind of work that the wealthy did? No, they just get the rich to do it. Sorry, completely wrong. They'd get the poor to do it on their behalf, and they'd cream off the profits. And that's what this poem seeks to, again, reinforce. So industrialization also led to economic migration. You might have worked on a farm. The work in farms would have dried up. And so people migrated, for purposes of economy, from countryside to city, from the rural to the urban areas in search of work. The critics suggest that, to a significant degree, Blake was inspired by the French Revolution of 1789. Why? Because, well, what happened was the end of the monarchy in France. We had sort of three key ideas of the French Revolution, which I'll write in now. I've almost certainly written them in the wrong order. Liberty, freedom. Égalité, equality. Fraternity, brotherhood. You don't have freedom, you don't have equality, you don't have brotherhood if you've got monarch up here and lowly people down here. The way that you can achieve something resembling freedom, fraternity, and equality is by perhaps chopping off the heads of the monarchs, and that's what happened in the French Revolution. So the critics, as I said, suggest that Blake was inspired by the French Revolution of 1789, seeking to incite, to some degree at any rate, to incite a kind of change within the British society of the time. There was a monarch who spent his time sort of waging war in foreign lands for no obvious reason. A demonstration of the power of the British Empire much of the time, but what's the point in going and waging war in other countries when right under your nose you can see deprivation, when you can see oppression, when you can see how the downtrodden and disempowered people are left to suffer, and how prevalent it is. It's just outrageously wrong in Blake's perspective, from Blake's perspective. And you'll notice there that what I just began to do was use these keywords in my speech. That's what we do when we're writing, hopefully. And the final thing that I've made a note of is the control and tight structure of the poem. We'll look at that moment in a second. The control and the tight structure of the poem mirrors society in London. And so where do we see that? We have 4 stanzas, 1, 2, 3, 4, each with 4 lines. There's even a very sort of formulaic rhythm and rhyme scheme to it. I wandered through each chartered street, A, near where the chartered Thames does flow, B, marking every face I meet, A, marks of weakness, marks of woe, B. And if we continue that sort of all the way through the poem, we can see how there is this incredibly tight, controlled, sort of rhythmical feeling. Now, in many respects, it's a kind of key feature of Blake's poems. It reinforces that these are songs. And they are in fact designed to be sung. I'm not feeling that brave for this video, sorry. But they are designed to be sung. So in part, that's why we have the rhythm. But there's also the idea that this structure is deliberately meant to be cyclical, circular. And the final stanza of the poem helps to reinforce this. The cyclical nature of the poem, the repetitive nature of the poem. And just note where we see all the repetition, goodness. Marks, marks, mark, marks, mark. Every. The repetition there is a way of reinforcing that it's just so prevalent. It's so commonplace. It's there over and over and over again. It's not just one man crying. It's many men. It's many children. It's not just one person who's sort of manacled, who's handcuffed, who's imprisoned, who's enslaved. It's most, every. And the repetition helps to reinforce that. It helps to create a sense of scale. That's almost typically what repetition does. It reinforces, it creates scale, it emphasizes. The same thing applies really to any sort of instances of alliteration. Alliteration, which is in the poem, it nearly always just emphasizes tone. So if the tone of a poem or a piece of writing is jolly, well, alliteration emphasizes the jolly sort of nature of it. If a poem is humorous, alliteration emphasizes humor. In this instance, the tone of the poem is one of bitter anger. And so any alliteration, any repetition helps to reinforce, to emphasize, to accentuate the sense of scale, to emphasize the bitterness that Blake feels. Right. So just to go back to this idea of things being cyclical, we have this kind of rhythmical pattern which feels repetitive. We have the use of repetition itself. The actual type of repetition is anaphora, in every, with the same word being used to begin each line. So the anaphora helps to accentuate the sense of scale. But as we move down to the final poem, the final stanza, but most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. The idea of this cyclical, circular, the sense that Blake sees society as one unbroken circle where you're born, you're an infant, and you cry. You live a life of misery. Maybe you get married, but this marriage is just a sort of another step towards death, and then you die. But you probably have some children, and they wake up crying, and they live a life of economic hardship. They live a bitter, sad, hopeless existence, and then they die. But they've had some children, and they have a shoddy life, and probably have some children, but then they die, but they've had a rubbish life, and round and round and round and round and round it goes. And so Blake seeks to incite change. He wants change at the same time as acknowledging that, well, change doesn't really appear to be possible because of the cyclical nature of the poem. It's endless. This is not a virtuous circle. It's the very antithesis of that. Why? Let's just kind of focus on the poem's words a little bit more, the language. I wander through each chartered street. If you charter a plane, or if more accurately, a travel operator like, I don't know, TUI does it. They charter planes and fly people off to Greek islands or Spanish islands or whatever. Well, hopefully they do. In the time of the pandemic, maybe they don't so much. But they take control or ownership of the plane. They become responsible for it. Blake is telling us here that the streets are being owned. The streets are controlled. Okay, you think that's not that unusual, is it? I don't think it's that unusual. But the second line reveals where it is unusual. He wanders through each street which is controlled, near where the chartered Thames. We think chartered Thames? Who can control the Thames? And there's the corruption in place, because the wealthy are able to control, to take ownership of what is natural. And if the wealthy are able to take control of what is what is natural, Blake helps to accentuate, to reinforce that this is in fact unnatural. It's immoral. It is wrong. It shouldn't happen. So, yes, again, we have repetition to accentuate the scale of the corruption. But to control the natural is unnatural. And mark in every face I meet scars of weakness, scars of woe. There's your alliteration. Weakness and woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. A manacle is a handcuff, but who has created the handcuff? You have. Look at me being all intense and weird. But you have created them in your mind. Put it this way, I'm a powerful person. Let's use an analogy. I'm a powerful person. And I have some manacles, I've got some handcuffs. And if you do something wrong, I'll imprison you because you've done something wrong, which is not, I don't like it. So I will lock you away. Eventually, you, at the bottom of society, you begin to learn that. And therefore you begin to self-police. You begin to self-monitor. You want to do something, you want to rise up, but you begin to tell yourself, I can't do it. I'm not powerful enough. I don't have the influence. And you effectively imprison yourself. Man is not free. He only thinks he is. There I am paraphrasing the words of a philosopher called Rousseau. Man is not free, he only thinks he is. He thinks he is. There's also an idea that everywhere man is in chains. Not a very sort of cheery idea, but are we all imprisoned? Do we prevent ourselves from doing as we want to do? Is it the rules of government that make us act as we are? Or is it ourselves? The third stanza, as I said, begins to give us some slightly more specific examples. The chimney sweeper cries, I won't dwell on that anymore. Every blackening church appalls. In what way is the church black? The church is black as a consequence of smog, of pollution, of the effects of industrial revolution. But significantly, the church is black because the church is immoral, because the church, which is meant to help us, does not help us. The church, which teaches a message of love thy neighbour, treat others as you would wish to be treated, does not do that. Some people can get very upset about the Christian churches because they are phenomenally wealthy. Catholic Church, for instance, very, very wealthy, and people can, as I say, get quite upset about it. In this instance, maybe I shouldn't refer to Catholicism. This is the 19th century, said that a few times, and therefore it's the Church of England. And who is the head of the state? Who is the head of the Church of England? It's the king. So this is an attack on monarchy throughout much of the poem, a monarchy which controls society. It's an attack on what we might call the establishment. The three pillars of the establishment being monarchy, the government, and the church. To some degree, they're all one and the same. It can appear that way, at any rate. And the blackening church is immoral. Why does Blake make reference to the soldier? Because the soldier is controlled by the government, by the monarch again, to some degree. What is the soldier? A soldier is somebody who signs up, who joins an entity bigger than themselves to fight for and to protect the interests of their country. But in this instance, what's the soldier being asked to do? The soldier is being asked to protect the monarch. And who would the soldier protect the monarch from? Well, if it's in the UK, if it's in England, it would only protect from the citizens of the country. Why is that ironic? Because the soldier would presumably once upon a time have been of a lower status. The soldier is perhaps a person once at the bottom of the social ladder who is being used to oppress other people at the bottom of the social ladder. Blake doesn't need to tell us it's an outrage because we can figure it out for ourselves. He doesn't need to tell us to be angry because it's self-evident that we should be angry. Because the soldier, his sigh, his actions, his impatience, his anxiety, why do people sigh? It leads to blood running down palace walls. The soldier is used to oppress others. He moves on from that to the final stanza, but mostly those are the things that he hears. And to my mind, the use of the word plague is an interesting one in the last line, because society is plagued, society is diseased, and unless that sort of circle is broken, there's the circle once more, unless the circle is broken, then we're just going to continue on in the same old way. That's the poem in many respects. There will always be other things that you can find out there, other videos, they're all worth a look. In terms of giving you different interpretations of the poem. But broadly speaking, these keywords here help to articulate the kind of central message of the poem. We are looking at this from the perspective of power and conflict. The power of the wealthy leads to the deprivation of the poor. The corruption of the rich impacts the poor. The hypocrisy of the church leads to a circle of impoverishment. Those at the bottom of society are downtrodden, they are powerless, they are oppressed, they are disempowered, they are disenfranchised. I said earlier on that I love the word agency. I love the word agency because agency captures the idea of power and choice. Those at the bottom of society don't have power. They don't appear to have much choice. And as a consequence, they are left to suffer And that's just not something that Blake can subscribe to. That's it for this particular video. Work to follow. Hope it's been useful. All the things I've been saying, annotate. Get it written down. Make your notes wonderful. Thanks very much. See you next time.